Hello and welcome back. In this session we're going to look at repairs and repairing obligations in leases of commercial property. I'm sure the area of repairs is one which facilities managers are particularly familiar with, so really important that you understand what the requirements are under a lease and the implications of the lease clauses. Start by having a look at this example lease clause and have a read through that. A lot of words in there. Talks about well and substantially. Then it talks about repair, maintain and clean. And it talks about keeping in good and substantial repair and maintenance and in clean condition. And it talks about replacing landlord's fixtures and fittings which are beyond repair at any time during the lease, but also at termination lease. So there's quite a lot in there, and what we'll discover is that the wording is particularly key. There's lots of case law around repairing covenants in leases where there's dispute between landlord and tenant as to how far this quite goes in terms of the landlord's obligations to maintain and repair and to put in repair leased property. So just start off with taking a few minutes out, see the take action icon, to think about why are there repairing obligations in a lease from the landlord's perspective and from the tenant's perspective. So just take a couple of minutes, pause and think about that. Okay, so what did you come up with? Well, the obvious one from a landlord's point of view is that they want to maintain the value of their investment. As an investment, if they are looking to sell that investment on, then it's important that it is in good repair, the property is in good repair, to present the property in the best light, whereas if it's in disrepair, that will doubtless have a potential negative impact on the value of their investment. So it is about preventing that disrepair. Also, from the landlord's point of view, it's about ensuring compliance with any statutory requirement. Interestingly, within most commercial property leases that are on institutional terms, there is usually the obligation on the tenant to comply with all statute that shall apply from time to time. So, for example, there's new statutory requirements brought in, for example, around the Fire Precautions Act or Legionella or whatever it might be, that place requirements to carry out work to the property. Usually within the lease there's a requirement that the tenant undertakes those repairing requirements, so statutory compliance. Also, it might be if the landlord has the property on a lease themselves and then leases out to your organisation as tenant, they will have repairing obligations within their lease, so naturally for it to be a nice tidy investment they will want to pass on all their obligations to you under your lease. And again, in terms of maintaining value investment, it's about minimising their outgoings. The landlord wants a nice, clean investment. So if they're receiving a rent of £100,000, they don't want to have to then be deducting from that income any sum to cover the cost of repairs that they might end up having to carry out. So it's about passing that obligation on to the tenant again. From the tenant's viewpoint, slightly different. It should be about providing a safe and attractive working environment for occupiers. The state of repair of your property can have an impact on attracting new staff into the business and retaining those staff within the business. Similarly, it can have an impact on customers. It creates an impression of the organisation. So you will want the property hopefully to be repaired and maintained to provide that safe and attractive working environment and preserve an appropriate corporate image. Also, you want to be clear from the lease who is responsible for what. So is it a full repair and insuring lease so that you're very clear that you as tenant are responsible, or is it a property where it's in multiple occupations? So for example, you have one floor of an office block which has 5 floors in it, so the landlord is maintaining responsibility for certain repairs and services. Well, what are they? What's the landlord's responsibility? So you want to be sure what your responsibilities are and what the landlord's responsibilities are. And clearly from a tenant's viewpoint, it's also about you're wanting to restrict your outgoings. So this comes down to the wording of the lease. So yes, you are probably taking on a lease, if it's full repair and insuring, where you take responsibility to maintain in good repair and condition the property as it was let to you. But do you want to take on a responsibility for improving or renewing services and facilities within the building? Again, lease wording in this area is key, and there's lots and lots of case law relating to disputes in this area. So really important to understand when a lease is being drafted what it says about repairs and maintenance and improvement and renewal. So that question about who repairs what. The lease repair clause will set out the responsibilities, and you may have reference that's specific, i.e. responsible for individual elements. It may specify what the landlord is responsible for and the tenant's responsible for, if it's not a full repairing insuring lease, or if it is a lease where there are common and shared services that the landlord takes on the responsibility for and charges the cost back to the tenant. Or it may in fact relate to the whole of the demised premises, so it may say that the tenant shall maintain the demised premises in full repair and condition. Talked a little bit about full repairing and internal repairing. So, going back to full repairing insuring, this is where the tenant has full responsibility for all repairs. So that's the building structure, external fixtures and fittings, internal fixtures and fittings. And the insurance bit is where the landlord will place the insurance, but the tenant will reimburse the landlord for the cost of that insurance, the insurance premium. Internal repairing insuring is where the tenant's responsible for the internal demised areas, and the landlord has responsibility for other areas, which would include building structure, external fixtures and fittings, any common parts, services, insurance. Now, in majority of commercial leases of modern premises, whilst the landlord will take that responsibility on in the scenario of multi-occupation, they will then recover the cost through a service charge, and we'll look at service charges in another session. Just going back to repair, this question of to what extent, I've alluded to the fact that there's lots of case law around this, so it's really important you understand what wording is in the lease. Does it talk about good and tenantable? Does it actually use the terms rebuild, renew, replace? Does it say in substantial repair and condition? Does it say to keep brackets to put in repair and condition? So these are really important, and again this is where your legal advice comes in as being important. So what does the lease say, but also cases that go to court and where the landlord and the tenants aren't able to reach agreement, its judgments are made having regard to the general age, condition, quality and location of the property. So if it's a Victorian property in a kind of not a particularly not a particularly good location, the judge may have regard to that fact, and there's lots of case law around disputes over should a tenant be required to put in tanking to a basement that's damp when it was always damp, and it would never have originally been tanked, because isn't that deemed to be putting it into repair when it never was in repair, it never was tanked originally. Also critical, absolutely critical, is there a schedule of condition attached to the lease? Mentioned that in one of the earlier presentations. If when you're granting a lease as a landlord or taking a lease as a tenant and the building isn't a brand new building, might not be in absolutely perfect condition, it's a good idea from a tenant's perspective to actually have a surveyor capture the condition of the property as at the date that the lease is granted. So to identify any particular defects or disrepair, If that's agreed to and forms part of the lease as a schedule to the lease, then the repairing covenant, the full repairing obligation, is restricted to any items of not full condition that are referred to in that schedule of condition. So you can't be expected to repair, for example, a broken pane of glass in a window that's recorded in a schedule of condition, because that was there at the outset. So what happens at the end of a lease? Because during a lease you'll be required as a tenant to maintain it in full repair and condition, and the landlord can come along at any time and inspect the property and say to you as a tenant, you haven't repaired this particular item, or it's not in full repair and condition, so require under the repairing covenant that you undertake this work. At the end of the lease, there's usually the requirement that you return the property back to the landlord in full repair and condition in compliance with the repairing covenants of the lease. So it's normal that the tenant will repair and reinstate before the end of the lease. If you look at the photos on this slide, you'll see there's racking in the top one and internal partitioning in the bottom one. So in this instance, the landlord would expect, if you'd fitted that racking during the term of the lease, for you to remove that racking and make good any damage to the flooring, etc. Similarly with the partitioning, if you'd install that during your occupation, to remove that partitioning and reinstate, for example, ceilings, floor coverings, etc. If the tenant hasn't done that by the end of the lease, then the landlord can undertake that work and recover the cost from the tenant. However, it's not as simple as the cost, because what the landlord's claim against the tenant is limited to is the diminution in value of what's referred to as their reversionary interest. So you're handing the property back to them. Now, if as a result of you not handing it back in full repair, it's impacted on the value of that property, then that would be their claim. So that might be different to the actual cost of undertaking the work. The cost might be more than the diminution in value. So it's always important to understand that it's limited to the diminution in value of what the landlord is getting back in terms of the property. Also, what's important to try and understand is what's the landlord's intention in terms of the property after you've vacated and effectively given the property back to the landlord. Because if they are intending to substantially refurbish, and that means they're going to be stripping out the property, and then the fact that you haven't handed it back in full repair in terms of internal alterations or fitting out might have no impact at all on the reversionary value, because they're going to be stripping out the property anyway, so they wouldn't have a claim against you as tenant for not having done those repairs. More importantly, if their intention is to actually redevelop the property, then the fact that it's going back in full repair has no impact whatsoever on the reversionary value of their reversionary interest. So they would have no claim, the landlord would have no claim against the tenant. So it's always important to understand what's the landlord actually intending to do, and is the fact that we've not undertaken these repairs having any impact on the reversionary value of their investment. So, I'd like you just to have a little think about what you might do with this scenario that you're presented. So, your organisation's merged with a competitor, and you've taken over the management of its 3 leasehold properties. So, this business that you've merged with has 3 properties, operates from 3 properties which are held under lease. You've carried out an inspection of the properties and noted there are a number of maintenance issues requiring attention. So the question I'd like you to think about is, what are the key issues you need to consider and what action you will take? So think back through the points that we've covered in this particular session, and what would you need to understand in terms of the lease, and what might that then mean in terms of the action that you need to take.